All right. Well, Spencer and Emma, thank you so much for joining us live. I'm Dana, obviously, and we're joined today with Rachel. Rachel is a Western alum. Your work is primarily sculptural, but I'm really attracted to like the optical properties in your work, as well as how you disseminate the ideas of your three-dimensional sculptures out into the world for folks that can't be there. I think you're really good at like instilling the content and the concepts optically in those images. So anyways, I don't want to take too much of your time, so I will just turn it over to you.
Thank you so much. Okay, so I'll start sharing my screen.
Perfect.
Okay, let me know if you can or cannot see any of this.
I can see it. Spencer, Emma, you guys good? You can do a thumbs up or a yes.
Yes.
Yay. Oh,
Yeah, I
yay,
can
Emma,
see it.
you're here. Good.
Hi. I'm muting again though.
No worries.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much again, Dana and class, for having me. It is a true honor to speak to some Western students. It's been a minute. My name's Rachel, and I'm an interdisciplinary artist who works in visual art, language, and poetry. I'm actually from the Seattle area originally, but now I live and work in Philadelphia. But that being said, having spent the majority of my life surrounded by the mountains on one side and the Pacific Ocean on the other, the region has continued to play a really important part in my work. I'm primarily engaging this idea of yearning that emerges from distance and displacement. I'm the only one from my immediate family who lives on the East Coast. Everybody else lives in Washington State and actually within just like a 2-mile radius of each other. But except for my mother who lives in the US, the rest of her family's in Taiwan, and that will all come back later. And so I'm interested in translating mental exertion and emotional endurance into like a physically felt experience. And through the tactile metaphoric qualities of language, I'm particularly interested in kind of sinking into and tending to the aches of navigating violence and care, grief and joy, as well as intimacy and longing, these kinds of themes that are kind of the bones of our lives, I would say. And like I said, I majored in sculpture when I was at Western. I got my MFA in sculpture from the Tyler School of Art and Architecture. And though my work isn't explicitly photography, I do often approach the medium as a form of sketching images and critically examining what it is that I'm looking at and questioning what I'm looking at is often where I begin my work. And especially when I think about sculpture, it's like the materials that I use are heavily embodied with a pre-existing knowledge that isn't necessarily easy to narrate. So I'll get into a little bit of that as I go as well. So that way you get an idea for what I might mean by that. So the first work I want to talk about is called Fetch the Moon from the Seabed, Heidi Lao Rie. This was made in 2021, but I began thinking about it a year ahead, like back in 2020. During the shutdown of the pandemic, I was isolated on the East Coast. Like I mentioned, I was the only one here. And so I sank into like a really deep homesickness and yearning for the mountains and for the ocean, for this region, in addition to my family. But the thing that I kept gravitating back to was the landscape. And I found myself like desperately pulling up photos of Washington State and like trying to find any source of entertainment that like featured the geography. Like no matter how cheesy the movie was, like as long as it had like evergreen trees and mountains, I was like, it makes me think of Washington, so I'll watch it.
Did you binge the Twilight series?
Oh God, I didn't go that far, but that next artist, he for sure did.
Nice.
So not quite to that extent. But yeah, I was just thinking about that kind of landscape that I was like so missing, and to an extent of like homesickness is a word that we use for it, but it has like an embodied, like there's like an ache to it, like a weight to it that is impossible. At least I was finding it difficult to find words for. And so I began thinking about like this large swath of land that separates my family and me. And then I began thinking about like, oh, what must have it been like for my mother who had immigrated, who's actually separated and connected at the same time by the Pacific Ocean. And so I began thinking about language and translation as a means of investigating this kind of yearning and displacement, this thing of like a singular word could not encapsulate. And so this is actually a long form poem using reimagined language learning worksheets. And so it looks like worksheets on the surface. And then as you kind of delve deeper, it touches upon themes of home, of traveling, of foreignness, of longing to return and it not living up to the fantasy. And they're sized to my torso. So I measured the length of my torso because I wanted it to be felt in my body in the same way that like learning a language, you kind of have to stumble through it and it takes time. So all of these, like both the size of these works and like the colors, I'll get to the colors later, but all to say kind of, I really wanted to have that embodied feeling translate from language into physical. And so you can kind of see some of the text here where it says, so it gets into the specifics, right? So like I look at the Olympic Mountains from a distance in terms of translating. And I understand your longing, I feel your homesickness. And I'm thinking about like these languages and these characters and how when they're isolated, they have different meanings. And then depending on how you combine them, like new meanings arise. So for example, hope is separate from thirst, but when you combine thirst with hope, ko it means to desire or to yearn for. And so you can kind of like think about how the order in which you place words carry different meanings and carry different weight. And then the more I thought about this landscape that I was so desiring, the more I realized it was actually the blue of the mountains I was really homesick for and the blue of the ocean. But then like, as any of you know, if you do actually like live in Bellingham, you know, like if you're going from Seattle to Bellingham, the mountains in the distance, especially as you're going through Everett, are blue. But as you're driving through them, they're actually in fact probably green, just due to the trees. And so I was like, oh, actually the blue is not the blue of the mountains, it's the blue of the horizon that I'm constantly chasing, which is what writer Rebecca Solnit called the blue of distance. And a dear friend of mine sent that to me when I was trying my best to describe this homesickness to him. And he was like, oh, you should check out this essay called The Blue of Distance. And she's talking about how blue is the color of there seen from here. It is the color of where you can never go. And so for this project, it became like the color of the permanently ungraspable. And so they gradually went from deep blue to near white or near white to deep blue, depending on your reading direction. And then I'll get back to the reading direction in just a minute, because that has a lot to do with different interpretations and meanings arising. So here's another example where the word for foreign, yang, and sea, high, when they're combined to high yang, if you're reading right to left, that is, it means ocean. And so considering this idea of like the ocean tied to foreignness, tied to journeys, has been a really important part of my work. And so there's another example. The blue of the ocean is due to its immense depth. So again, like kind of hinting at that idea of the blue of the ocean being blue only because of how deep it is. Whereas if you like scoop water from the ocean into a glass, it is nowhere near that color. And so again, thinking about like desire and yearning. And when I mentioned reading direction, I wanted to especially bring up these two words together because to wish, to miss, to think, to believe, xiang and hui. When you read it left to right, xiang hui, it means a desire to return, like I want to return. But if you read it in the other direction, hui xiang, it means recollection or to recollect something. And Chinese itself is like a very directional language where every stroke has a specific order and it has to be drawn from left to right if you're doing a horizontal stroke, for example. And every stroke has a order in which you do it. And every stroke has a name for that stroke, so you know what you're writing. So everything is like really bodily and really directional oriented in the way that you orient yourself to this language. And then at the same time, obviously, as a lot of you know, like during this time, there is like this huge awareness of like anti-Asian hate and violence that was occurring in this country, which is also nowhere, like nothing new to the history of the United States, though very easily forgotten. For example, like the largest mass lynching in US history happened in the late 1800s in LA, and it was like more than 15 Chinese men and boys who were lynched because of a rumor that was being spread that Chinese immigrants were murdering white people left and right. When really it was just like a white police officer and I believe a Latino rancher getting mixed up in a gang war between two like rival gangs. In any case, I became like increasingly frustrated, to say the least, of whenever like mass like these violence occur, be it Black Lives Matters, like the murders of George Floyd, to anti-Asian sentiment. Whenever these things happen, it's like a huge skyrocket in book sales. And I became extremely frustrated with this desire for knowledge or the need to seemingly understand, quote unquote, the other and able to care about them. So on one hand, sure, like learning's great and all, but it seemed as if it was more of a way to kind of break somebody open to try and understand them and able to then deposit yourself conveniently back in your own body and kind of like brush your hands off and be like, oh, at least I'm not one of those monsters. And then I became inundated with like images all the time of like both from like these violent crimes to then people at protests to then people doing like all these hashtags and buying books, like I mentioned, especially after the Atlanta spa shootings. And then it became to question like this inherent good that we're told about like the inherent good of representation, where sight equals empathy. And I have a really hard time with that, and I actually actively push against that. And so I was like incredibly angry, and I was thinking about, I don't know if any of you know the writer Ocean Vuong, who's a really beautiful writer and poet. And he talks about how care is anger grown up. And it's what happens in the aftermath. If you allow anger, care is what happens on the other end. And the Chinese character for anger, qi, is the same as life force. And so it's kind of like this galvanizing force that you kind of need to recognize. And so I wanted to create something that takes the form of something that is meant to be healing, but is incredibly painful. In the way that like anybody knows who's been in an accident, like physical therapy is incredibly painful and trying to make your body strong again. And so I settled upon this reflexology platform. Reflexology being this kind of medicinal practice of using pressure points. For example, like the soles of your feet will directly impact your liver health, for example. And I washed each of these stones by hand because I wanted to be able to feel the roughness, like the texture of the rock. And that way I would be able to better disseminate moments of relief along with acute pressure. And this is an example of a documentation video. That's the tricky thing about sculpture is like how do you kind of communicate a bodily feeling into a flat format. So oftentimes video I have found to be a very helpful tool in that. And so you can kind of see how it's like this kind of hesitant walking, this stepping forward, this retreating as you're kind of having to navigate the limitations of your own body and to find moments of respite amongst this acute pain. For the beneficial, for the benefits of your long-term health. These kinds of pathways are really common in Taiwan, like in public parks, you'll find these long pathways of reflexology walks, and you'll find like these old grandmas just like running across them like it's nothing, and they do it every day. A lot of them say it's like attributed to their long lives. And I've tried it, and it does take some practice too. So I think about practice and practicing tenderness, and that word tenderness too, like tender as in like it's soft. And to tend to something, like to give attention, to care to something, but also like tenderizing. It's like quite violent. And so how this food of course carry a lot. And then I'm also going to briefly touch upon this corresponding particular, which is some sort of video, and I'll go over this later. And so part of this piece, I also incorporated this reflexology brochure, similar to what you would find in a doctor's office, like explaining your body parts. But instead of the typical reflexology points, for example, like point A to your heart, point B to your liver, I transformed the text so that it would be something else entirely. And in fact, it has two narratives depending on how you flip it. So it's kind of an image of what it would look like if you were to flip one over. And then also I wanted to touch on another way that it's been saved, I should say, or like documentation. And so I've also created it as in an artist book format. This is like the like everyday person one where you that you can purchase on printed matter or at printed matter, I should say. And it's like made to be size of a traditional workbook booklet. And the pages flow from deep blue to near white to deep blue again. So it's kind of trying to mimic the way that the room itself is circular and how there's like no beginning or end. And so the book then becomes a circular object. I also have this like hand. Oh, this is hard to see because I'm not a person. Oh, okay.
Wow, yeah, that's awesome.
It's a large, I can show it at the end if there's interest, but it's like a large version that's hand bound in a traditional like Chinese binding. And it's made to the scale of my arm. And so that way with each turn, you would feel the page. So it's really large. When you open it, it's roughly 24 inches wide. And it's kind of unruly in the same way that language learning is awkward and stumble. Just to jump back into that really briefly. And this becomes also like a kind of documentation of the larger rock piece. And so you can kind of see where the text transforms into something else. And so I'm also interested in the way that certain numbers sit next to each other. So there's also potentials for other poems to come about. For example, if I wanted to do like 12, 11, 41, that would become as in, let's see, or 11, 12, 41, I should say, as in looking after, as in care, being seen without dying. And here's the other foot. And so thinking about repetition too, so like 3, 3, 3, 3, 3, then it becomes something more like fear, something like fear, something like fear, something like fear, something like fear. And so I'm wondering, like thinking about repetition, which kind of comes back into my work time and time again. And then when you unfold them totally, it becomes something else. It becomes actually like more of a back and forth. So for example, where does it hurt? Somewhere between heartbreak and rage. Something like fear, cutting wakes into the air as you walk. How is your heart? Show me how you loved me. The way my mother made me weep in front of a mirror, looking as in looking after, as in care. So it kind of continues down. And then always in the wake of these kinds of atrocities, or in the wake of violence, people always want to celebrate. Well, very well-meaning people always want to celebrate excellence. You have terms like Black excellence, Asian excellence, queer excellence. And so it became kind of disheartening and frustrating for me because it started wondering like, okay, well, what about like mediocrity or less than or the poor or the undesirable? As if everything has to be public and everything has to be excellent. And why can we not have a private life or like an interiority outside of a public excellence? And so I started thinking about like this climb, this idea of like straining to climb something, this upward mobility of the American mythology of upward mobility, for example. And again, kind of returning to the ocean, thinking about like the ship's bell as an object of warning, like traditionally used to sound a warning, or to mark a sailor's death. And then, so this text kind of like scatters and crawls up the wall and becomes fainter and fainter because I'm trying to think about how this ache and this frustration I was feeling in my body, how do I translate that into a visible format, like an utterance? It was like this quiet rage and a soft utterance. And how do I kind of like lean into that and that disappointment? And so they become almost like footholds of like this impossible climb, this thing that you can't ever actually reach. Like you'll never actually be able to hear the sound of that bell or to warn one another. So this one reads, and especially like thinking about going back to like the American myth, also thinking about the violence of the American lexicon, especially as how we celebrate victories. And so thinking about like you killed it, or like I bombed that test, or I nailed that. Thinking about like blockbusters, if anybody remembers Blockbuster or has an inkling of what that is. It's actually like a nickname for a bomb that would blow up entire blocks. And so how that kind of became a celebratory thing of like a blockbuster movie. Again, like it's also like tied to death if you kind of examine American language. And so this one kind of reads, they will seize you by the chin as if to lift your eyes to the sun, all while praising you're making a killing. They will say, you're blowing up. You do this faithful work. Look, everything has a price. They say, bite the bullet. We bite, red and reaching. Is this light what I have been begging for? And so it kind of like hopefully wanting to like lean into that sense of disappointment upon reaching whatever goal that might be. And I think a lot about this. There's this really phenomenal, beautiful book called Beholding by Ross Gay, who's one of my favorite writers. And he has these lines in there where he talks about his father enlisting in the Vietnam War the day his number was pulled to be drafted. So that way he could avoid the actual fighting. He could pick and choose where he served, for example, or like what department he served in. And so he talks about war and how it is this idea of like murdering and being murdered, which in other places is called a war, which in other places is called intervention. And I'm thinking about like, oh, well, actually the most decorated regiment in US history was an infantry made, I think it's the 442nd Infantry, made up of second generation Japanese Americans who wanted to prove to the government that they were not like the other Japanese, that they would be willing to kill their own and to die for the sake of this country. And so what it means to kind of like really in a very sad way to prove yourself a citizen of this nation through death. And so like if that's excellent, then I don't think I want it. And then comes The Heart Bears a Blade. And this work, I kept thinking about, and Ross Gay is a much greater student of this and teacher of this kind of like intermingling of joy and sorrow. And I learned a lot from reading him. And there's this day where I had like a phenomenal, like really beautiful day at the beach with some friends. And it was one of those most like, it was like taking a deep breath and like letting it go. And then that very same night on the way back, there was a shooting that happened in South Philly. that we had heard about. And so we had to avoid certain streets because they had closed it off. And so thinking about these kinds of constant interminglings of the two and how they're always coexisting side by side and in fact probably need one another. But the thing that was really unsettling to me was that I was quite numb to it. Like in my head, I was like, oh, of course there is like another shooting. It's just like a thing that happens. And that was a feeling that I was actually far more disturbed by than the actual event. And so I wanted to kind of investigate what that feeling was that I was experiencing. And so I was reading all these like psychology books, and apparently it's like a way it's like a way that your mind protects itself is to kind of numb it when you experience a lot of traumatic events, whether or not you were there, even if you're like inundated with it. And one of the first things that therapists try to do for people, especially for people who experience actual post-traumatic stress, but anybody who experiences traumatic stress in their lives, is to kind of reground the person's body and the weight of their living. And by that, I don't mean like religion or anything. It's like, and it's not like the physical weight of your body. It's like this feeling of like this aliveness. Again, like hard to kind of communicate. And this is often done through dance or Tai Chi or anything that makes you aware of like the physical limitations of your body, the stretch of your arm, the extension of your leg, the tempo of your heart, and like the rate of your breathing. Like anything that makes you more aware of your aliveness is like the therapy that we'll generally start with. And so on the other side of this work was a series of gym mirrors. And so the word ren, which is the Chinese word for to endure, to tolerate, to bear, also to restrain oneself, is actually composed of two separate words together. So the top half is ren, which is the edge of a knife. And then the bottom part of the character is xing, which is heart. So it's like a visible characterization of like what it feels like to endure, like a blade resting on one's heart. And so part of this work, an integral part of the work was like a translation, like a reimagining, learning language, like repeat after me audio. But instead of anything practical, like where's the bathroom or like table for two, please, it actually reveals something else, something that is like talks about joy, but also talks about cruelty and violence, and also about like a deep love for somebody. So I'll just play that portion and using video to kind of try and encapsulate what it felt like to be there. And so splitting the audio up into, in the space, it was a left and right speaker in the space, so it would draw you back and forth, thinking about translation. And so in the video, I wanted to kind of keep that split, so it splits between like the left and the right speakers. And let me know if you can't hear it.
1. 我一想到你就忍不住热泪盈眶。
My eyes fill with tears just to think of you.
我一想到你就忍不住热泪盈眶。 2.
2.
我无法忍受在生命里没有你的那种意念。
I cannot stand the thought of not having you in my life.
我无法忍受在生命里没有你的那种意念。 3.
3.
晚上10点18分，我忍不住睡着了。今天我跟你在沙滩玩得很尽兴。
10:18 p.m. I couldn't help falling asleep. I had so much fun with you at the ocean today.
晚上10点18分，我忍不住睡着了。 今天我跟你在沙滩玩得很尽兴。4.
4.
在某个地方，枪声划破了凝滞的空气。我知道你已精疲力尽，但你还是必须得再忍耐坚忍一段时间。
Somewhere, the sound of gunfire sliced the air again. I know you're exhausted, but you must hold on for a while longer.
在某个地方，枪声划破了凝滞的空气。我知道你已精疲力尽，但你还是必须得再忍耐坚守一段时间。5.
5.
毋庸置疑，我们每个人都有某种残忍的本性和意念存在在我们内心深处。
To be sure, we all have within us the capacity for cruelty.
毋庸置疑，我们每个人都有某种残忍的本性和意念存在在我们内心深处。6.
6.
即使是那般的让人无法忍受，我还是十分用心的想要感受发生在我周遭的一切。
I want so badly to feel the weight of my living, even if sometimes it is hard to bear.
即便是那般的让人无法忍受，我还是十分用力的想要感受发生在我周遭的一切。7.
7.
秋天终于来了，我看着阳光从白橡树梢倾洒下来，碎波凌乱的光影，亲吻着你昂首的脸颊，我忍不住微笑了起来。
It's finally autumn. I watch the dappled light fall through the white oak, kissing your upturned face, and I can't help but smile.
秋天终于来了，我看着阳光从白橡树梢倾洒下来，水波凌乱的光影，亲吻着你昂首的脸颊，我忍不住微笑了起来。
So one translation for every stroke, and then every stroke made accordance to, again, like go into my arm. And you can kind of tell, I hope, by the Chinese portion, like the hearing part, like hearing the tonal shifts. For example, it's a monosyllabic language, so it's all tone based. So ma, are all different words. And so like learning this language, you have to really like really pay attention, because everything relies on tones and context of like what precedes and follows that word. And so it is like a very bodily And then at the same time that the Heart Bears of Blade was on, it was at that practice gallery in Philadelphia. And this one was up at the same time at another gallery in Philly called Automat. So it's like this kind of cross-city exploration of just the singular word. And this piece is called Love, If We Could Stand It. And so it's using the same word, but this time I have an uncle who's a calligrapher, and I asked if he wouldn't mind drawing some options out. And the ones he thought would be best, and I totally agree when we were trying to talk about how this calligraphy might work. He wanted it to be a water or a fluid style, because it's more about the feeling of the word, not so much the exactness of it. And so unlike Tending with the 8 foot by 8 foot reflexology platform, this one is made to a singular body. Because I was far more interested this time to kind of figure out how a singular person navigates or negotiates, I should say, negotiates the weight of their body. And so there are no moments of respite. And so it is much more like pinpointing that acute pain, and trying to figure out how to translate endurance in a way that doesn't allow for breaks. So you either have to participate or step immediately off. And so you can kind of see how it's made primarily for two tops. I've seen a couple people try and use it, but the really lovely thing about that is that they're all everybody kind of like holds on to each other, which is an unexpected bonus of this work, this kind of mutual support that they have. Even with the large one, I've seen an elderly person walking on it and another younger person walking along the outside of the rim, giving them their arm. And so that's been a lovely surprise. That's kind of become part of the work now. And so I'm constantly thinking about how I can twist the knife a little bit more. And so this work was kind of an attempt at that, moving on from Tending. And then I'm going to close with this artwork called Sweet Nothings, Feast Your Eyes, which is part of an ongoing series called Sweet Nothings.
Rachel, can I interrupt real quick?
Yes.
What was the title of the previous piece? Love If You Could Stand It.
Yeah, Love If
Okay.
We Can Stand It. Yeah.
Got it. Okay, I had a question that I want to circle back to on that. Love, We Can Stand It. Got it. Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, and I'm constantly thinking about how like the title can offer like another layer to the work, beyond just like untitled. So yeah, and then so then it became, like, as I mentioned briefly about the past works, like my apprehensions towards representation, because being seen is something that everybody always talks about. Like, oh, I just want to be seen, but at the same time, being seen allows you to be hunted. People target Chinatown and massage parlors because they know who frequents and who lives in those places. And people target like places like Pulse Nightclub because they know it's a queer club. And so what does it mean then to have spaces created for safety, but then at the same time, the idea of sight having but ties to potential and oftentimes real violence. And so thinking about that phrase, feast your eyes, and how it ties to something pleasurable or like awe-inspiring, and how that kind of break down through this Snellen chart. So again, like directly related to sight, into something a bit more sinister through repetition. And it's made completely out of sugar. And I do like how it has that kind of, which is hard to see in the photo maybe, but that kind of shimmer that sugar cubes have. But this in a much larger scale, obviously. And so kind of having that sinister sweetness tied in, because sugar has that really dark colonial history with slavery and forced labor, all for the sake of sweet tooth. And also like easily dissolvable and consumable and delicious, and like gluttonous. And so I think tying those things together between like consumable bodies and identities with sight was really important to me as I'm trying to like parse out these questions. And I think it's really important to approach art as art and poetry, literature in general. It's like I feel like all the best ones, the interesting ones, tend to engage questions and not answers. Like nobody likes the kid who raises their hand in class who already knows the answer to the question. Like nobody likes that kid. And so I feel like the best artists are the curious ones who like don't know the answers to the things as they're trying to parse out their own questions, which just lead to more questions. And so this particular work, Feast Your Eyes, I was trying to think about sight, the complications and like the really complex relationship of sight and consumable identity. And so I was revisiting some old texts, including Susan Sontag's on photography, for anybody who is interested in art and especially photography. I think it's like one of the most, if not the most important texts, but Dana can correct me if otherwise. But I am thinking about a lot about the like the violence of photography, the violence of sight, and this was written in the 70s, and it's like scary prophetic in how she talks about, you can easily use it to talk about social media and it would be completely applicable. But the language that we use around photography, again, like the language of American excellence being tied to war and to violence, like the language that we use around photography is hunting language. And so it's kind of replaced the gun in many aspects, like shooting something and capturing something. The person in your photo becomes a subject, they become an object. And so what does it mean to then acquire somebody through sight? Yeah, so again, like these are all questions that I'm still trying to make sense of in my own work. And like questioning the ways that people outside of like whiteness or whatever dominant culture, trying to question the ways in which people outside of those dominant cultures are expected to perform consumable identities, I think, is really important to me. But also, these things I'm talking about are quite violent and quite ugly, but also, of course, my work, I don't think is that, nor like people generally talk about it as like beautiful and beauty, which I don't think beauty is useless, because it's like using the debris of our lives to make something beautiful is in my opinion like what is worth living for. So it is like an expression of like I am still here and will continue to be. So yeah, we'll see what happens next, but that's probably like my most applicable work to thinking about like photography and sight, especially for this class. But thank you all so much for sitting through with it.
Thank you, Rachel. Yay. I see many ways that your work applies to photography. Like when I look at your work, I think of it, this is, totally projecting, of course, but I think of it through a photographic lens, or medium process, I should say. I have a million questions, but before I jump in, Spencer or Emma, do either of you have questions or anything that you want to say, anything you responded to of Rachel's work?
I don't have any questions, but I like the depth of the conceptual ideas behind everything and how it's all sort of like really cohesive. And it's interesting to hear your explanations of how you're thinking about this work and like you're reflecting on your own life and how that comes out into your like studio practice. It's just really interesting.
Thank you so much.
I don't
Thanks
have
for
any
sharing
questions.
with us.
Oops. I don't have any questions here. I was going to say, great job. I think it has a lot of detail and it's a great presentation. I love it.
Thank you.
All right, then I have a couple of questions. One, like right off the bat, you talked about like the idea of yearning, like longing for something as being a driver through a lot of this work, which I think is really incredible. And yeah, like that's a potent force. How do you balance that? Like, as a person and as you grow, you pursue happiness and fulfillment, right? And so like you're moving towards a state of resolving things that you want. How do you balance then like allowing yearning to flow into your life, which feels like kind of like antithetical to that tangent, like how do you do, like my work is about like longing for something, but like as you grow and become like more resource enabled, you could achieve some of those things. So yeah, like how do you, like you miss your family, like you could move back to your family, right? But life doesn't always take you that way. So how do you balance that, I guess? Like how does that function for you personally and in making work as an artist?
That's a really beautiful question. Should I keep screen sharing or should I close out?
I guess you could close out, sure.
No, I love that question, and I think it is one I think about a lot, and I'm wondering how much of this kind of, it's like a very Western idea of thinking of like acquisition, I think, especially as it relates to desire, and how maybe desire then is not a problem that you can solve, or maybe that should be solved, and maybe it is instead a feeling that you can submerge into as just a feeling rather than this need to acquire something. And I'm wondering how much of that is tied to fantasy as well, or like, and like the larger scheme of like American, like manifest destiny, like the
big time, big time, yeah, right? Yeah.
But in terms of personal life, it's like it is also like every time I come back to Seattle or to the Pacific Northwest, it is like that sinking feeling of like, oh, this is not the place anymore. But then whenever I return to Philly, it is like this fantastical dream of like I miss the mountains and the trees and like and that's true, I do. But it is always more beautiful because I cannot come back, at least in the way that I fantasize about.
I think that the phrase that you said was the color of the ungraspable. So beautiful.
Yeah, I think about that a lot, and it's not to say I don't have goals that I would like to do, but I think it is important, especially for like young artists or students or whoever you might be. Like I teach college students as well, and I think it's important for them to realize that it's like your life is not meant to be, at least in my opinion, like a series of goals that you obtain and then that's it. It's over. And so maybe I think about, if anybody hasn't read that book On Earth We're Briefly Gorgeous, also by Ocean Vuong, it's so beautiful, but it uses that Japanese writing technique, Kisho Tenketsu, which is like, it's used a lot in other East Asian writing. But you know how Western writing is like beginning, middle, and end, and it's always like all rise, and it concludes and like nicely in a bow, which is okay. Like I think that's like I love books written like that, that conclusion, that acquisition. But a lot of like using this technique, it's like literally a turn of your body. So it's more of a cyclical thing. So there is no actual like steadfast conclusion. It's more like all these things leading up to this moment, a moment of reflection that you then like turn back on. If that makes any sense. So maybe it's like thinking about it more like that.
Yeah, no, that's beautiful. I don't want to, we're almost totally out of time. A question that I had, and one thing that I really like, one way that I really think of your work in a photographic perspective is that you do like, photo is all about like you wrap a box around something, right? Like that's the frame, and it's all about like, I'm going to show this and I'm not going to show this. So the play between show and hide is such an optical thing, such a photo thing. And that's what I see in your work. Like you're always like, you give a little and then you kind of take a little back, or you show some and you pull some back. And like very, very obviously you do that with like exposure or brightness, right? Like this sheet goes from blue to white, and as it goes that way, you're hiding more and showing less. Or like with the sugar piece at the very end, right? Like it's big to small. The ship's bell piece, I forgot the title right now. Anyways, but one thing that I was kind of curious is that like some people that look at your work and experience your work, they know Chinese and they know English, and so they sort of experience this kind of wholeness, right? But many people don't. I don't know Chinese, and so it's really exciting and interesting for me to like hit this thing where like I don't get this content, and so as the artist, like you're not showing that to me, you're hiding that from me. Maybe like, or that's my read of it, and I really enjoy that, and that's just like very feels kind of photo-ish, the show hide. But how do you decide I'm assuming you can speak both languages and you understand like the entirety of your work. How do you decide to like, all right, I'm going to show this, this will be in Chinese, this will be translated, this won't be translated. I'm going to keep this kind of hidden from those who don't know Chinese. Like, how do you establish that threshold for yourself, or for us, I guess?
Yeah, that is like that kind of opacity is something I'm really interested in, and how there is power in being invisible or power in withholding information. And some things, especially when it relates to translation, like some things are just like impossible to translate.
Yeah,
which is kind
exactly.
of language. But even with Chinese, like there's so many politics with it, because there's like simplified and traditional, depending on if you're Taiwan or China following the revolution. So there's a lot of that as well, but it is like I'm making these decisions based off of, I would say, from a position of power, and like, and how I can kind of drive that knife a bit. That's not the most clear answer.
You do it because you can.
Yes, I can. Everything is like about that tension. Like I really love that tension that exists between sorrow and grief, and also like beauty and horror. And so anywhere that I can kind of like ramp that up a little bit is where I kind of want to exist, I think.
Nice. Yeah. Existing in that moment between beauty and horror. That's pretty epic. That's art. Cool. Spencer, Emma, any last comments before we let go of Rachel?
I think I'm good. Thank you, though.
Sorry.
Thank you both for joining us. I really appreciate it. It's always epic when people can join us live. This video will be up, made available for class, but I'm so happy that you two joined us today, and it's nice to hear your voices.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you.
Take care. Take care.
You too. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Well, Rachel, thank you so much for your time today. That was awesome. I know I appreciated like getting this insight into your work. So yeah, thank you so much. And then, it's just us now. Do you have a few minutes? I actually had like a personal question about like using family. Can I ask you about that?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, we're still recording, so we can toss this in. How does that go? Like, are they excited to help you? Who was the woman's voice like in Heart
Bears a Blade?
Yeah, Heart Bears a Blade. That was your voice, but then who was the other person's voice? Was that a family member also? Okay, your mom. All right, so you're like, hey, it feels very vulnerable to use family. Also very like potent, but yeah, you kind of mentioned like your uncle, the calligrapher. Like, how is using family? Are they like, this is awesome, or are they like, what does this mean? What is this for? Like, are they arts minded already, or?
No, I don't think so.
Yeah.
No, my mom actually. I had to go to Chinese school every Saturday growing up, and my mom was a teacher at that Chinese school, so she'd be teaching this language, and she was also a conductor back in Taiwan.
Oh wow!
Chinese orchestra. So she has this kind of like desire to perform.
Yeah.
She wouldn't say so. She'd be like, "I'm so humble, Rachel."
Nice.
So I'm like, "Are you?"
Yeah.
She's more like, she always says her catchphrase is this an art?
Nice.
But she's always like excited to do it, because it is this kind of, I think it's more about this feeling of like, oh, like I'm still needed in this capacity.
That's cool.
In a different capacity in that sense.
Yeah.
But it does get ethically thorny. I have another work where I also interviewed my mother when my father wasn't home. And that one I'm still like figuring out the ethics of that. Like, she knew it was an artwork and she knew it was going to be public, but in how I show it and when, haven't quite decided. So I haven't shown that publicly since I first debuted it, just because of the certain things that she talks about. Yeah, but it is like exciting to involve them when I can and when I think it's right. But sometimes I think it's I prefer them to actually, it's okay if they're not interested in art. Actually, I don't think that's like beneficial for me. I like being Rachel, like the separate family Rachel, and leaving like artist Professor Rachel separate from them. And it's like, it's unreasonable for me to expect them to be interested in art. I think they work such long hours. They have other things to figure out. They immigrated. They have a whole life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah. Well, it was cool. I mean, that recording is beautiful, and the background sound just worked perfect. Like when the sirens came in, that was like, oh, so soul crushing. Knowing the background to that piece.
That was all Foley.
Okay, so. Yeah. That's awesome. Well done. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. It's always hard to like just say like, all right, we're done. Bye. But thank you so much. That was awesome. And hopefully my like insistence on being like, your work includes photography. Like that's just how I view it, I guess. And I think you deal with optical relationships really wonderfully.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I mean, you're not wrong. I mean, I research and I read a lot of people who constantly look at photographs, and it's kind of impossible to separate yourself from photographs anyway, because it's like that's our life with Instagram.
Yeah, exactly.
How do you separate yourself from that?
Yeah, yeah, yes, yeah. And then when you're like, yeah, like Susan's hot tags on photography, it's like, well, yeah, that's part of the work.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, cool. When we're done, yeah, if it's not too late for you and not too cumbersome, could you send me that file that you recorded, and then I'll slap them together and I'll send you a link to the video. Yeah.
Can you send me your email?
Oh yeah, sure. Yeah. I'll text it to you.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you so much, Dana. It was lovely seeing you.
Yeah, likewise. Yeah. Thank you.
Bye.
All right, bye.